Elaine Alec is an author, political advisor, women's advocate, and spiritual thought leader and teacher, and is the direct descendant of hereditary chiefs. For over 2 decades, Elaine has been a leader expert in Indigenous community planning, health advisory, and creating safe spaces utilizing Indigenous approaches and ceremony. She is the author of Calling My Spirit Back, a book which links an extraordinary personal examination of lived experience to a much broader overview of serious national sociological concerns, accompanied by tangible steps to approach them. She is involved in the Sexual Harassment, Advice, Response, and Prevention for Workplaces Advisory Committee, a board member with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and recently completed a 3-year term as the Union of BC Indian Chiefs Women's Representative, where she advocated for Indigenous women and girls' safety through facilitating safe spaces to plan and drive policy change at various levels of government. It's my great pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker, Elaine Alec.
Thank you. White has kohalt, lahaf lahap, salachalach, stinksiel, yilmihum, chichamala, incha, isquis teeth kanit, kinokanakin, sihuapm. Good day, elders, family, friends, leaders, young people. My name is Tithkanit and I'm from the Okanagan and Shuswap Nations. My name Tithkanit was given to me on the day I was born from my tama, Elaine Alec. It translates into standing by water. My English name is Elaine Alec. I am the daughter of the late Saul Kenzie Basil, who was the son of Saul and Louisa Basil from the Bonaparte Indian Band and the Sihuap Nation. And my late mother was Sophie Alec from the Penticton Indian Band from the Syilx Nation. She is the daughter of the late Chief Jack Alec and Elaine Alec, who is also known as Philomene Francois, who was the daughter of Chief Francois, who is also known as Soorimpt, who is the son of Kizbuk-Jayton. And we are descendants from Pelkamulaxw, who was one of our hereditary chiefs in northern Washington. And his life was dated back to the 1600s. He had 24 wives across the nations from Washington into British Columbia, from the Rocky Mountains to the ocean. And so there are a number of reasons why I introduce myself in that way. Number one reason is because my elders told me to. Number two reason is I was told to speak my language in public forums as much as I could, because there was once a time when my parents and my elders were not allowed to do so without being punished. And I was also told that when you take the time to introduce yourself, what land you're from, and name your ancestors out loud, that they will come stand with you. And so even though I've been speaking for a really long time, probably about 30 years I've been public speaking, I still get really nervous. And I'm always wanting to make sure that I say the right things. I was mentored to not write my speeches and to always speak from the heart. And so I believe that when I introduce myself in that way, that my ancestors come help me share the words that need to be said, and also to hold back on things that don't need to be said at the time. And so I'm really happy to be here. I've been working on and off on different projects with Ending Violence Association since I was the Union of BC Indian Chiefs Women's Representative, where I met Tracy and just really admired her advocacy and the work that she was doing, and really appreciated some of the teachings that she shared with me and the work that she was doing, and wanting to include me in many of the things that she was involved in. And so during my time as the Union of BC Indian Chiefs Women's Representative, I did some work with the Ministry of Public Safety and Solicitor General. And with that work, I traveled across the province of British Columbia to host 12 sessions called the Path Forward, Indigenous Women and Girls Community Safety Sessions. And in those sessions, we talked, we asked some really hard questions. Some of those questions included, we know that there are many people in our communities who have been abusive, who have done things that everybody knows about, but nobody does anything about. We know that there are a lot of things happening within our own families, within our own communities, and how does healing occur between the perpetrator and victim? And those are only 3 areas of some really big issues that we decided to talk about, because we acknowledged, we knew that you cannot change or heal which you do not acknowledge. And if we're not acknowledging some of those really hard things, then we can't find ways to change them, and we can't find ways to heal from them. And so we utilized ceremony through all of these conversations, and provided space for people to share openly from their perspectives and their experiences on what was happening with them, within their families, within their communities, and within their nations. And when we were done those 12 sessions, the work was held up by everybody that participated. And we ended in ceremony in Vancouver. And we wrote the report, and the report's actually online on the website www.pathforward.ca. And the report was held up by many of our communities. We let people know that the information that we shared and collected was not for government, it was not for us, it was for the people who participated, and that they could utilize any of that information that we had in that report to build a foundation for their own planning within their own communities. And so many of the different nations utilize that book and those questions to start asking them within their own communities and nations. One of the things that came up from that work was that people said that we need to find ways to cultivate these spaces. We need to find a way to bring women together to have these really hard conversations, because right now we don't have that. We don't have the support to do that. So many of our organizations are expected to come forward and do this work for an honorarium or nothing at all. And so we found that so many of our women's organizations have been able to do so much work with very little financial support. And so that was one of the things that came out, was that we need to find ways to cultivate these spaces. And we also need to provide training and capacity for people to facilitate these spaces, because so many people didn't feel confident in hosting spaces like that. And so when I was done that work in the summer of 2019, I felt a sense of responsibility to provide something to help others cultivate and create safe space in the way that was done through those Path Forward sessions. And that was when I decided to write my book. And so my book is called Calling My Spirit Back. And it was originally written, I wrote that book to all of those individuals that sat in those circles. I tried to think of all of the stories that I had heard throughout my life to help me get to where I am today. And those stories are the reasons that I'm alive today. I spent the first 6 years of my life with my grandmother, who was a language speaker and a knowledge keeper. And I didn't realize until I was 30 years old how special and how important that was. I thought everybody that grew up on the reserve had that experience and learned those things. And I learned that wasn't the case. I learned that my tama was a rebel, and she sacrificed a lot to teach us those things and to teach us the language. I spent a lot of time with my tama because my mom was a practicing alcoholic and my dad had left. We grew up in violence. There was a party in almost every house in our community, and so we didn't have a lot of safe spaces. And so I experienced a lot of abuse, including sexual abuse, from the ages of 4 to 10. And that really shaped the way that I would continue to lead my life. I started smoking at 10. I started drinking at 12. I started hitchhiking across BC by the time I was 13. And by then I was a raging alcoholic, and I was very promiscuous, looking for love and putting myself in really hard situations because I didn't feel that I was deserving of having a good life. And so I struggled with alcoholism and self-harm for a majority of my young years. And when I was 17, I became pregnant with my son, and I gave birth to him when I was 18. And then I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis and fibromyalgia. And I really struggled through that time. And I started drinking really heavily. And when I was in my early 20s, I attempted suicide for the last time. And it was in the hospital when my doctor came to me and he looked at me and said, "You don't have to live in pain anymore." And I knew that he was talking about more than just my physical pain. He was talking about my emotional and mental pain. And it was at that moment I had a tiny glimmer of hope that maybe I could have a life with a little less pain. And so I made a commitment to start getting healthy, so that I could be there for my son. And so I did a number of things to get healthy. I tried to get sober for the next 8 to 10 years, but I couldn't do it because I realized that there were so many feelings that I had learned to shut off. I wasn't allowed to cry. I wasn't allowed to show emotion, that showing tears is weakness and being vulnerable is not a good thing. It's nobody's business. And so I learned to lock up all of those things. And so when I would get sober, I realized that the drinking was hiding those feelings. And so when I was sober, the feelings wanted to come back. And I really had to work through that. And it wasn't until I was 30 years old that I decided to turn around and face those feelings and start my healing journey. So as of October 10th of 2020, I have 13 years of sobriety. I have 3 children. I have 2 businesses. My book has sold over 6,000 books. As a self-published author, that is almost unimaginable. I was told that self-published authors are lucky to sell 150 books. And that by Canadian standards, selling between 3,000 to 5,000 books is a bestseller. But because I'm self-published, I don't get that. I don't get to say that, but I like to share that because it shows that when you really believe in yourself and you put your heart behind something and continue to put yourself out there, that things will happen when people tell you that it can't happen. And so my favorite thing about this book is that young women are starting to read it and reach out to me and say that I've shared their story, and that because of that, they've been able to leave abusive relationships, that they've been able to do something for themselves, to love themselves a little bit more. And I think that's the reason why I made the commitment to put myself out there to share my story, because it's really hard. I talk about my childhood and my loss and my grief and some of the really hard things that have happened to me. But I talk about the teachings that my tamat gave me throughout my life and why I'm still alive today. Because I believe that my tamat breathed that life into me from the moment I was born, and for as long as she could. And I believe that those stories of love and those repetitive stories every night were the reasons why I was able to come through what I have and be where I am today. My book also came out when Black Lives Matter happened. And so people started to read it and told me that my book was also a tool to learn diversity and inclusion. And it was a tool for decolonization. Because at the end of my book, I talk about the 4 necessary conditions for cultivating safe space. And I'm just going to share a diagram that I created as part of the training sessions that I do that are based on my book. But the 4 conditions, the 4 necessary conditions for cultivating safe space are: number 1, understanding self; number 2, a love-based practice; number 3, patience; and 4 is discipline. And number 4 is discipline. It's talking more about ceremonial discipline. It's talking about the ability to listen with a discipline that you are taught when you learn spiritual teachings or religious teachings, that if you've ever tried to meditate for 5 minutes to push out everything from your mind and just focus on the presence of yourself, you know how hard it is to do that. And so the ceremonial discipline that I talk about is being able to listen to every single person and every single voice without moving into your own judgments, and to be able to listen to people without trying to figure out if it's right or wrong, good or bad, or how I'm going to debate it or prove them wrong, but actually listening to them with an understanding that every being, every living being has purpose, and that if you open up your mind with love, that you can take in what they're saying as information. And when people feel that they've been heard in that way, things begin to change. The relationships begin to change, and how we work together and move forward begins to change. One of my friends, Jessie Hemphill, taught me a few years ago that there are 4 tools for colonizing people. The 4 tools are to promote sickness and death, to promote exclusion, to promote shame, and to promote oppression. And she said, in order for us to decolonize, we have to do the opposite of those things. And so, how do we begin to promote well-being? How do we begin to promote inclusion? How do we begin to promote freedom? And how do we begin to promote validation? And when you look at Indigenous knowledge and teachings and nested systems and systems thinking, we all come from those systems. It doesn't matter what land we come from or who we are. We all have these teachings if you look back far enough. And so looking at how we can incorporate those things into all of the work that we do, in how we create our agendas, in how we have our meetings, in how we sit together and plan. How do we promote all of those things so that we're promoting well-being, inclusion, validation, and freedom? Because when we promote those things, we promote safe spaces. And when people start to feel safe, they're able to move from the lower part of their brain into the most creative part of their brain, where they can think clearly, where they can provide solutions, where they feel confident in themselves. And that's where the most beautiful planning begins, and the most beautiful working relationships happen, because we feel safe knowing that our voice and our experience and our perspective is valid, even if we don't like each other or get along, knowing that if I present something, my voice or whatever, that, those things are going to be taken into consideration and included. And so many times we only want to work with people we get along with. We only want to work with people who think like us. We only want to work with people who agree with us, because we can move more quickly and move ahead faster. But we're excluding others when we do work in that way. And so we have protocols that we put in place that ensures all of those different perspectives can come together and participate. And so there's a really simple way, simple way I ask people when they're looking at, is this safe or is this not? And how are we making decisions? And so when we look at colonial practices and structures, they're very linear, they're fear-based, and they are based on a lot of control and mistrust. And so everything is controlled, the outcomes, the questions, the way we do things, who we invite, very controlled, because we have fear that we'll lose control or we won't be able to accomplish what we need to in the short amount of time we have. And that's based on fear. But when we look at matriarchal and egalitarian teachings, they're based in love, they're based in trust, they're based in faith. There's not always a straight line from A to Z, and it feels like we're not going to get to the end if we're, going all over the place. But when we start to do things in that way and we include people and we do that investment of time in building those relationships, we're able to accomplish so much more than we would if we were doing it the other way. Because the other way, based on fear and exclusion, you'll notice that we'll have something done and then things pop up to stop us from moving it forward. or people will be angry because they weren't included in it, and people will try to hold it back and because they don't see themselves in it. One last thing I want to talk about on this diagram are the perspectives that I've shared on it. We have every community has these perspectives in it. The traditional perspective, which are the knowledge keepers, the corporate memory of an organization, the ones who like to pass their knowledge on to the next generation. They often like rules. The innovative perspective are the ones who are visionaries. They like to think outside the box and ask a lot of questions. Often people think that they're crazy because their thinking is so out there. Traditional perspective and innovative perspective are polar opposites, and they often have conflict. Relationship perspective are those who want to take their time and include everybody. They don't care how long it takes. They will listen to every person that's there and make sure that they're brought along. The action perspective are those that are, we've been talking about this for 30 years. Let's stop talking about it. We just want to see action. How are we going to implement this? What does that look like? And action and relationship also have they're polar opposites and often have conflict. But our systems and our stories and our protocols tell us that each of those perspectives is important, and we need to bring them together in order to do the work that we need to do, and that we have to be open to all of those perspectives when we're doing things. Before I start wrapping up and open it up for questions, I'm going to share one story. So this diagram is on my website. My website's www.elainealec.com. And my elders told me that knowledge is no good if you don't share it. And that part of our family's teachings is that we need to teach people how to live in reciprocity with all living beings within our traditional territories. And when we do that, when we take that responsibility seriously, people will start to learn how they need to be interacting with the natural laws that supersede the other laws that we have today. And so this diagram is free for sharing. It's on my website. You can download it and print it. And I made the diagram in this way and took out references to our stories and our language and our teachings, because I know that people have hesitation about doing certain things a certain way because they don't want to be accused of appropriation. And so I created this diagram for people to use in whatever way that they want to, without feeling that they're stealing or taking. This knowledge is meant to be shared. So the last story that I want to share is the Four Food Chief story. It's our creation story. This is the story that tells us how to govern, how to gather, how to make decisions, and how to listen to each other. It's one of our 4 stories that our elders said we have to pass on to our next generations. And this story is from before people were here, before humans were here. And so it goes like this. Before there were people, there were only animal people. And among those animal people, there were 4 chiefs. There was Chief Black Bear, who was chief of all things that walked on the land and flew in the air. There was Chief Spring Salmon, who was chief of all things that lived in the water. There was Chief Bitterroot, who was chief of all things that grew below ground. And there was Chief Saskatoonberry, who was chief of all things that grew above ground. And one day the creator came to the chiefs and said, there's going to be a being that comes, and you have to figure out how to keep that being alive. And so the creator left the being between the chiefs and left. And the chiefs looked at the being and said, this is the most pitiful excuse for a being we've ever seen. It's born with no fur to keep it warm, no teeth to eat, no claws to protect itself, nothing in its head. How are we supposed to keep this being alive? And so they talked about it for a really long time before they looked at Chief Black Bear and said, well, you're the oldest, you tell us what to do. And so Chief Black Bear sat there and thought about it for a really long time and said, I'm going to lay my life down for this being, and everything I am it can have. It can have my fur, it can have my meat, it can have my claws, it can have whatever it needs to keep itself alive. And so all the other chiefs agreed that they would do the same thing. And so Chief Black Bear said, I'm going to lay my life down now, and you have to sing me back to life. And so Chief Black Bear laid their life down, and the chiefs came to sing their song, and Chief Black Bear didn't come back to life. So all of the other animal people came, deer and muskrat and eagle. They all came to sing their song, and still Chief Black Bear didn't come back to life. Finally, the last being came. Let me sing my song. I want to sing my song. And everybody swatted Fly away. Go on, get out of here. Nobody wants to hear your song. All you do is eat crap and bug people. Nobody wants to hear your song. And it was Fly. And Fly managed to get in and landed on Chief Black Bear's ear and sang their song. And Chief Black Bear came back to life. And what that story tells us is that even someone as small and insignificant as Fly, their voice and song was just as powerful as the chief's voice and song. That when we take the time to listen to all of those songs and all of those voices, that we are so powerful that we can bring back life. Chief Black Bear represents the traditional perspective. Chief Bitterroot represents the relationship perspective. Chief Saskatoon Berry represents the innovative perspective. And Chief Spring Salmon represents the action perspective. And so it's really important to remember and empower people, to remind them of how powerful they are, that even a little tiny insignificant piece of information or contribution is needed to bring back life, and to create a space where people feel that, where they feel important, where they feel like they have purpose. And when people are able to contribute in that way, the things that we can accomplish. But if we're coming into a space feeling fear, feeling like we don't belong, feeling like my ideas are stupid, that I don't think like everybody else, I'm not going to want to share my voice or my song, and I'll keep it inside. And it's my voice and song that might be the last song that's needed to bring life into something. And so when we struggle and we wonder why things aren't working, it's a good time to take a step back and look at and ask ourselves really important questions around that. How am I contributing to ensuring people feel safe, people feel loved, that there's trust, that I'm not trying to control, that we're getting people to do work that they feel good about and that they're good at? Because through colonial structures and the way we build business and the way we create roles and jobs, is that we take people who have promise and say that we'll add capacity to them by building them, and they can get by learning this much or knowing this much. And when people are in those positions, they feel like they're never going to be good enough or that they're not smart enough, and it holds them back from being the best that they can be. And so learning how to build projects and build roles and jobs, and create teams where people get to do pieces of the work that they're really good at, and we all contribute to it. But that requires trust, trusting that I'm going to do what I'm good at, and knowing this person is going to do, and letting go of our babies and putting it out into the world in that way, knowing that everybody else is going to have to contribute, that I don't have to control this from beginning to end or have a say on how people are going to do this. And that's really hard work. It's tough work to do. And so every little tiny thing that we do that we can incorporate, those little tiny shifts, will start changing the way that we do business, the way that we do work, the way that we're able to utilize, this money that comes into our organizations to do really important work. That we have to start from the very beginning on asking people to be a part of it. Meaningful engagement means including people from the conception of the idea. Indigenous women are really tired of being called in to sit on advisory boards, to be that voice to contribute because they're Indigenous. It might not even be their area of expertise, but because they're Indigenous and somebody knows them, they try to pull them in. And that feels very tokenizing. And so we're really starting to speak up and reclaim our spaces and saying, we don't need to be on an advisory or a board anymore. We need to be treated as though we know what we're doing and that we can make important decisions for ourselves. And that needs to be equally supported in the work that we do. And so that's a lot of really important and uncomfortable conversations that we've had with Eva and with Tracy. And just have to say how nice it feels, how validating it feels to be able to share those things openly, and have people receive it and hear it and validate that and say, how can we do things differently? We're doing the best we can with what we have and what we know, but how can we start to do things differently? And so I hold my hands up to all of the individuals doing this work, because this work is rooted in a lot of trauma. And as people holding and carrying this work, we have to be aware of, you know, our own feelings, our own traumas, our own stories, while still doing our best to provide that safe space and support to people we work with. And so it's so much that I know that each and every one of you carry. And I'm sending so many love and good vibes and energy and prayers to each and every one of you as you continue to move forward working within these systems to do this really important work. So White Limb, thank you everybody for sharing this space with me.
Wow, thank you so much, Elaine. I can listen to you forever, and you know this. And I am just so thrilled that you are on our EVA team with the sexual assault funding. And as you work with us at EVA, I continue to learn from you. And you know, and I could even feel it in my body as I was listening to your keynote. I could feel myself giving myself permission to get calm and just not worry about what words are going to come out of my mouth next. And so, you know, you have this magical way of transforming your words into practice, and how people can really practically use that. And for that, you are our mentor. And of course, as you know, we continue at EVA to find ways to do better, and to be engaged in the decolonization process, and know that we have more work to do, and that we rely on our allies like yourself and others to guide us. So for that, I raise my hands to you, Elaine. And we have a couple of questions. So I'm going to read the question that came in. Thank you, Elaine, for your vulnerability. Your courage, your resilience is extraordinary. What would you advise me as a counselor, as I work with First Nations clients who have experienced sexual abuse and or substance misuse or abuse?
I think for me, because I've gone through so many counselors and therapists, the thing that I've learned and appreciated the most is somebody who doesn't get caught up in my story. It's really rare. I find that to find a therapist or a counselor that doesn't get caught up in my story. And then when it comes time to do the back and forth, they have a hard time formulating questions or asking quality questions. So that's one thing. The second thing, and I think was the most important for me, was sharing with me how the brain reacts to trauma and how it's a natural reaction, and that I'm not actually crazy. Because when post-traumatic stress disorder was explained to me and how the brain reacts to trauma and re-triggering, and the self-defeating behaviors we start taking part in when we've been triggered, we don't even know, but all of a sudden we just feel like we're going crazy. I can't think, I can't focus. Why do I feel compelled to do this? Understanding that it was a reaction in my brain to the trauma helped me understand I'm not going crazy. This is normal. I'm normal. This is okay. And I can work through this, I think was the most important piece for me when I started talking about my sexual abuse and assault, and a re-triggering later on in my life when I was in my late 30s, was understanding this is how your brain reacts to this, and this is what kind of happens there. And so, you know, when you talk about these things and how you're feeling and acting right now, that's a result of this. And I think that is one of the most helpful things that have helped not only myself, but when I've shared that information with other survivors.
Thank you, Elaine. I have one other question that's come in. Thank you for the powerful visual and aids understanding how to cultivate safe spaces. Thank you for speaking on the subject of fear and control. My question is, how do we affect change on a large scale, particularly with regards to policy?
I think we do a lot of work with governments who are trying to find ways to change policy and legislation. And I think the biggest piece for us, and when I say us is I work with a company and we're planners. And the biggest piece for us is making sure that we're including all of those voices to ask them about certain areas, whatever it is that we're looking at, like gathering as many voices as we can to contribute to that. And then the other piece of that is really understanding the systems that we're working within. And so, you know, there's a lot of education that has to happen when we're working with different ministries, with different like federal representatives, understanding what their mandates are and what they're able to work within, and asking them to put their best foot forward and get them to look at where the problems are, because they're going to look at our planning and say, well, that's not possible because we can't do that. And getting them to stop and say, well, why can't you do that? You know, what policy is telling you that that's not possible? And is that something that we can take out and look at and find ways to shift to support this work that's happening here? And so, you know, doing those shifts and that understanding and that patience and knowing that all of those voices are important, even if we're running up against them, helps when we're trying to make those shifts. And for me, it's always our teaching of 7 generations that helps ground me and have that patience, is that I'm here to ensure that things are better for the next 7 generations behind me. And that it's taken 100 years for us to get to where we're at now, and it's going to take 100 years for us to get out of it. And that the work that I do now is going to change the way things happen for my children. And so looking for those small things to hold on to and work towards, and knowing that I'm not going to see the type of change I want to see in my lifetime, but that doesn't get me down, because I know that what I do today is going to be something my children don't have to deal with. And so when we look at big systems change, understanding that I'm here for a purpose to do what I can do the best that I can, and finding ways to pull out, you know, the best in other people that I'm working with, so that we can be creative to shift and change those policies in little tiny ways so that we can take another step forward.
Thank you, Elaine. That's certainly something very practical that all of us can, you know, take away in a really tangible way, and not, you know, not blame ourselves for being able to make the big changes that we have visions of. I have one more question. Thank you. I loved what you had to say. Can you give some examples how practical ways to move away from linear fear-based approaches to anti-violence work? And heart emoji behind it.
So it is so hard. I did a talk for a university a little while ago, and one of the things was, when we're advocating and when it just gets really, really hard and we see all of the injustices and why things aren't changing, how angry we can get. And how do we take care of ourselves when that happens? And so, I use these diagrams in everything I do. And the one thing I've said to people, especially when I talk to people who are working on indigenization or indigenizing, how I grew up with a tama who knew the language, spoke the language, knew the protocols, grew up with elders who knew these things. I am Indigenous. I feel very strong in my identity. I'm very lucky for that I have a strong sense of who I am and where I come from and who I belong to. And I know so many people struggle with that sense of belonging. And so, when we feel strong in our identity and who we are, it helps us be able to move forward. But um, one of the things that I share is that even with that, it took me until I was 35 to start utilizing these processes and now and these teachings and put it into the work that I do. And I took little tiny tools and started incorporating it little bits at a time. And so I've been facilitating in this way for 10 years, but it's only been in the last 2 years that I have felt really confident that this way is a beautiful way, it's an effective way, it gets things done, magic happens. But I'm 44 now, and so it's taken me that long, and it's been little shifts along the way. And so the thing that I say is like looking at that diagram or thinking about the stories, what resonated, what felt good, what will you remember that you can incorporate that little tiny thing. And asking, is this coming from a place of fear? Am I making this decision from a place of fear? Or am I making this decision from a place of love? Am I fearful for my own safety, my own security? Am I fearful that what other people are going to say? And so the number one condition I share about cultivating safe space is understanding self. When I understand my triggers and how I react and how I'm making decisions, it's easier for me to cultivate and create that safe space and to start changing and shifting, the way that we do things. So really understanding that self and then asking, is this coming from a place of love or a place of fear?
Thank you, Elaine. We have two more questions. I think we have time for both of them. But before I ask that question, people are also asking if the participants will have access to a copy of your handouts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can get the handout on my website, www.elainealec.com. And I think I've done it so you can download it and print it. And you can use it however you'd like.
Wonderful, thank you. So I'll go back to the question. This question is from Child Protection Worker. And so the question is, as a non-Indigenous child protection worker, recognizing that the work that you're talking about takes time, how can we help the families with children who may be witnessing or experiencing trauma that comes before healing without causing further harm? So some direction for child protection workers who are non-Indigenous doing this work.
This is such a hard question. I actually worked with the Ministry of Children and Family Development for a year, was as long as I could make it. And I get asked this question, and I still don't have there's so much around it with jurisdiction and families and working with communities and empowering the nations. And I know a lot of the background and why that might not be possible. There's just so much there. There's just so much work to do. So I'm just trying to think about how to focus in on how can we help the families. And that's, really finding everything that you can to create those relationships between each other, because ultimately we're wanting our nations to take on more of that role and incorporate more of our teachings, and to do that. And just everything about the child welfare system is wrong. It's just all wrong. And I know that I don't know my answer is always to start recognizing the jurisdiction of Indigenous governments to make decisions for their own families and their own children, and to remove that completely from the province's responsibility.
Thank you, Elaine. This is the last question, and it's about safe spaces. So the question is it better to start from ground up, meaning take things apart and start from ground up for creating safe spaces, or to transform what currently exists?
So we can't, starting from square one isn't always as difficult as it sounds. It's just us being confident in this is the way. This is the way we have to do it. Transforming a colonial system won't work because you're working with a colonial system that doesn't work. It's the reason why it's been upheld and has taken over the entire world is because it works so well. And so moving away from that thinking and into this other space of building that trust and having these protocols and the way we gather and the way that we're vulnerable. There's two questions that we ask when we host sessions to create spaces. The first question is Switanwi, and that means who are you? Who do you belong to? And the second, that's an acknowledgement of the importance of identity and belonging. The second question that we ask is Stima Spuus, and that means what is on your heart? And that's an acknowledgement that we are all human beings with human feelings and experiences, and that those are important to recognize. And that those are important when we make decisions. So many times we're asked to leave our emotions at the door, that being emotional and vulnerable isn't professional, and that when we're in business and political spaces, we have to be on. We're not allowed to be emotional, especially if we're women, because we want to be taken seriously. And so we leave pieces of who we are at the door. We don't come and show up at these tables as full self, strong in our identity and our sense of belonging for self. And so when one of the challenges is showing up at these tables authentically as who you are and being vulnerable and being okay with having emotions and feelings and knowing those are strengths. And I know that's a struggle that many women have in a lot of these spaces, because we know, especially for women who've made it to a certain spot, we know what we've had to give up to be in those spaces. And it's really scary to be who we are because we have to have these walls up. But if we can start changing spaces by showing up as who we are and being confident in that and okay with that, that's where that change happens. And that's why understanding self and knowing self and being confident in yourself is so important in this work. Like, you have to understand self if we're going to shift and change systems.
Elaine, this can go on for quite some time, and I just want to thank you and let you know that you have inspired us all to find ways to tell our own truth. I think you've modeled that for us so that we can advance our own journey of healing. And I want to thank your Tama. I know she's with you. I know she's next to you. So hello, Tama. And thank you, Tama. Also want to thank you for your work on cultivating safe spaces. It's been so informative. We thank you for how to listen to people, and with what you've shared with us about opening our mind and focusing on love, introducing us to change, and inviting us to understand our own work towards decolonization. For all that, I want to thank you on behalf of all of us who are from across the province and beyond on Zoom, who've had the privilege of listening to you. Thank you.